Okay, today is our second day of notes for our Greece unit. And today we're going to be looking at the city-states of Athens and Sparta. Now remember, we call the Greek peninsula the Balkan Peninsula. We've got Athens right here, located on the Balkan Peninsula. But the Balkan Peninsula has an offshoot peninsula called the Peloponnesus. And that is where Sparta is located. As Greece comes out of the Dark Ages, which happens around 750 BCE, the city-state would become the political unit of Greece. And we've talked about city-states before. It means that each city was independent of one another. The Greek name for city-state was polis, and we still use the word polis today. Minneapolis, Annapolis are just some examples of how we use polis when we talk about cities in the United States. The polis was made up of the city itself and the surrounding villages and farmland, so about 50 to 100 square miles. Each polis would have an agora, which is the marketplace. Many would have an acropolis. Again, we see the use of the word polis. And the Acropolis was the fortified hilltop. We can see it in this picture here. It's almost like we have a plateau and they've built buildings on it. On the Acropolis in Athens, there is a temple to the goddess Athena. And as we said before, the populations of these city-states are not going to be very numerous. Okay, usually they have a population of less than 10,000 people. And that's because it's so difficult to farm and the land is so rocky, they can't feed as many people, so there are less people living in each city-state. So on the bottom left, we have the agora. These are the stalls that you would find in the marketplace. And they are, of course, ruins. We've got the Acropolis, okay, this fortified hilltop. And if your city was under attack, you would go to this hilltop because there's only one way to get up there, and you'd be able to at least have some defense from invaders. And on the Acropolis in Athens, they built the Parthenon, okay, this building on the top, and that was the shrine, the temple to Athena. Once again, we've got the Acropolis in Athens. And you can see how tall this is. You'd have to climb these cliffs to get to the top if the entrance right here with steps was blocked. Okay, so there's really only one way to get to the top of it, and you could defend yourself by blocking those stairs. In order to talk about the Greek city-states, we need to understand the different political systems that could be used by these city-states. We've talked about monarchies throughout the year. A monarchy is ruled by a single person, usually a king, and it is hereditary, meaning the rule is passed from father to son. Another political system is aristocracy. That's ruled by a small group of noble landowning families. We talked about that with China during the Zhou dynasty. Aristocrats would hold the power because they own the land. Okay, owning land makes you a noble, and when you own land, it gives you the ability to control food. Finally, we have an oligarchy ruled by a few powerful people. Usually these are business elite or military generals. We see examples of oligarchies when we look at some Central or South American countries when a military rule has been installed. We call it a military junta. We could also see Russia as an oligarchy. Although they are supposed to be a republic, we know that Vladimir Putin and some of his best buddies kind of just change their job titles. Putin goes between being president, and when he can no longer be president, he'll become prime minister and swap with his buddy. The first city-state that we're going to talk about is Athens. Once again, notice the Acropolis in the upper left with the Parthenon, that temple on top. In the center of our city, we've got the Agora, our marketplace, which is surrounded by other buildings, including bathhouses, courthouses, and temples. We've got the residential area of the city, the assembly, which will be important for people to meet and have discussions over politics. And the further out you go, you will find more and more farmland. The name of the city-state of Athens comes from the goddess Athena. She was the daughter of Zeus. And originally Athens was a monarchy. They had one king who ruled them. They also had an assembly. Of course, when we think of an assembly, we think of elementary school where all the students would come down to the gym or the lunchroom and meet. And the assembly is where the aristocrats, those landowners, would make laws. But there was constant power struggles between the rich and the poor. The rich were making the laws, but the poor really didn't have a say in the government. And that's going to lead to change that we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. The Athenians were known for their trade on the seas. Like most of the Greek city-states, farming was difficult, so they turned to the sea in order to gain the resources that they needed. And over time, Athens would become the center of Greek learning. Scholars from all over the Mediterranean world would come to Athens to study. So the Athenian government followed an evolution. And they started as a monarchy where they had one person in charge. But over time, they became an aristocracy. More people had power, but these people were rich landowners. They would turn to tyrants to help give the people more power, which eventually led to democracy, where citizens have power. So by 600 BCE, the city-state of Athens was facing demands for political and economic reforms, and the people opposed the ruling aristocracy. They wanted change, and they wanted power. Which leads us into the era of tyrants. As these clashes over power became very common, a tyrant would rise up. And a tyrant was a powerful individual who would seize control of the government by appealing to the common man. Now, when we think of the word tyrant, we think of someone who is evil or cruel. But in Greece, these tyrants were often great leaders, and they would try to help out their fellow citizens and try to give them more power. But they did so in a way that violated normal political traditions. They weren't being voted on to do this. Okay, so a tyrant seizes power, and in ancient Greece, they would give that power back to the common man. Over the next 100 years, we have four important tyrants or reformers who are going to change Athens. The first was Draco, who had his laws written down, and this meant there was less chance of corruption. Okay, if people can see that the laws are written down, that means the judges, who were usually aristocrats, couldn't change them. But all of these laws came with harsh punishments to try to scare people away from committing crimes in the first place. Next, we have Solon, who outlaws debt slavery. He said that no citizen should be able to own another citizen. So if you go into debt, you will not be placed into slavery. And he also made it a rule that citizens of any class could participate in the assembly. Okay, you could all meet and help decide on the laws. The third is Pisistratus, who divided the land of the rich aristocrats and gave it to the poor. Of course, that made the aristocrats very upset, as it broke the amount of power that they had. As the poor gained land, it made them citizens and gave them a greater voice in government. Finally, we have Cleisthenes, and he does two important things. He makes the assembly the legislative body of Athens, meaning the assembly now makes the laws. In the United States, we also have a legislative branch of government. What is the legislative branch of government in the United States called? Go ahead and write that in the chat. And that's going to be our Congress. The second thing that Cleisthenes does is he sets up the Council of 500, because it's made up of 500 members, who supervise the day-to-day work of the government. And the members of this Council of 500 were chosen by lottery. Okay, it was random. And whether you wanted to do it or not, if you drew that lot, you would have to do this job. So it meant that all of the citizens within Athens needed to be well educated so they can run the government. You don't want a bunch of dummies making decisions for society. So who is a citizen in Athens? Only free adult male property owners who were born in Athens could be citizens. So that disqualified many, many people, okay, including half the population, because half of the people living there were women. If you're a citizen, you have political rights and responsibility. You need to participate in government. But it also means that you needed to be prepared to defend Athens and go to war. Women and foreigners were not citizens. They had few political rights, and slaves had absolutely no political rights. The democratic system of Athens would become the foundation for modern-day democracies. Even though in Athens, not everyone was allowed to participate in decision-making, like women, slaves, and foreigners. So they've taken democratic principles that developed out of Athens and would be used in other civilizations, like the idea of direct democracy. Citizens vote on everything. Public debate. And citizens having duties. Okay, like the responsibility of taking part in government. And like in the United States, if you're a male, when you turn 18, you have to register with the Selective Service so you could be drafted to go to war. So these ideas came from Athens. Now in the United States, we don't really use a direct democracy. We have a republic, a representative democracy. So there are two forms of democracy we're going to talk about this year. Direct democracy, which comes from Athens, and representative democracy, which comes from Rome. And we use the Roman form of democracy, where we elect officials who are supposed to represent us in government. Because think about that your parents just wouldn't have enough time to vote on every single law that came up. So we vote for specialists and we hope that they make the right decisions for us. In Athens, only wealthy boys received formal education, and they would do that from the ages of 7 to 18. They studied grammar, poetry, history, math, and music, so they had a diverse course load. They also trained in logic and rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art of public speaking, which they would need to use when debating at the assembly. They would also have athletic contests, so they had PE as well. And there was military school, as each of these citizens would serve 2 years in the army after they turned age 18. Okay, so you were required to serve in the military if you were a citizen of Athens. Education for girls was much different. Girls didn't get to go to school. Instead, they were taught at home by their mother and other women. They learned how to raise a child, how to weave cloth, how to cook, and manage the household. very few learned how to read and write. So they did not gain the same respect as other women in the surrounding civilizations. Our next city-state is going to be Sparta. And although they were Greek, just like the Athenians, they had a much different lifestyle. Sparta was located on the Peloponnesus Peninsula, which is that offshoot of the Balkan Peninsula. Here we can see Sparta. They were cut off from most of the rest of Greece by the Strait of Corinth, this body of water right here. In 725 BCE, the Spartans conquered the neighboring region of Messenia. And the people living there, the Messenians, became Helots. Helots are almost like slaves. The Helots were peasants who were forced to work the land. Okay, so they were not slaves because they had freedom to do what they wanted after work, but their job, and the only job that they could have, was to be peasant farmers. And the Spartans would take half of their crops every year. In 650 BCE, the Messenians revolted. They were sick of being Helots, and they outnumbered the Spartans 8-1. And the Spartans barely put down this rebellion. And at that point, Sparta then dedicated itself to becoming a military power. They would never have anyone rise up against them and take them to the edge of defeat. The government style of Sparta was much different than that of Athens. They had an oligarchy where only a few powerful people held any political power. They had the Council of Elders. These were 30 older citizens who proposed laws to be voted on, and they were the ones who held the real power in Sparta. From there, an assembly of Spartan citizens could elect government officials and vote on key issues. But it was really those elders who held power in Sparta. The government also controlled education and the court system. They had 2 generals who ran the military. They're called kings, but they weren't monarchs. They were more or less generals. One would keep half the army at home to defend Sparta, and the other would have half the army out in the field, training and preparing for an attack if they needed to do so. Spartan society was made up of 3 groups. So at the top of the social order were the descendants of the original inhabitants of Sparta. They held the most power. The second group were non-citizens who were free. These would be those who worked in commerce and trade. They were not given the same rights as the Spartans because Spartans distrusted traders. And the third group at the bottom of society were conquered and enslaved people, the Helots. Spartan society was based around making Spartan men the ideal warriors, the best soldiers they could possibly be. And this started out at birth. Unhealthy infants would be taken from their families and left to die out in the wild. Now, many of these babies did not die. They would be taken in by Helot families who would find them crying, and they would grow up and become Helots, peasant farmers as well. The idea was that these unhealthy babies would grow up to become unhealthy men who could not contribute to the army, and that made them useless. By age 7, boys would be placed in the barracks. They'd be taken from their families and they would live with other boys along with soldiers. They were given a sparse diet, meaning they didn't eat very much, and training was rigorous. It was meant to try and break these boys so that when they went to war, nothing would be able to break them. By the age of 20, boys would become men and full-time soldiers. They could then marry, but they continued to live in the barracks with their fellow soldiers until the age of 30. At the age of 30, men were expected to have married and have had children. They could then join the assembly and vote for their leaders. At age 30, they could finally move in with their wife, but they were expected to eat at the barracks with their fellow soldiers until they turned 60. By 60, if they made it that long, they could finally retire. They wouldn't have to worry about eating at the barracks anymore. They were done being a soldier. But again, not many made it to that age. So education for boys in Sparta was much different than that of Athens. It did begin at age 7, when the boys were taken from their families and sent to the barracks. At the barracks, they learned how to march, exercise, and spent their time fighting each other to try to figure out who the strongest of these boys was. It didn't matter what the weather was, you were training. You were given a light tunic and no shoes. And the idea was that they were going to toughen your feet up for those long marches if you had to go off to war. You didn't get blankets no matter how cold it was, and your bed was just a hard bench. For food, you were given a bowl of black porridge a day. Porridge is kind of like oatmeal, and the reason it was black was because they would use animal blood to give it protein. And if you wanted more food, you were encouraged to steal more food. But don't get caught. If you get caught, the punishment was severe beatings. And the idea was that when you are behind enemy lines in the middle of a war, you're going to need to find ways to survive. So learn how to steal, because you might need that skill later on in life. From 600 to 371 BCE, the Spartans had the most powerful army in all of Greece. And that's because military life dominated the Spartan lifestyle. Now, only citizens served in the army. So it was a very small army, but these soldiers were elite. They were the best of the best, and that's all they focused on. A Greek soldier is called a hoplite. So the Spartans had the strongest hoplites in all of the Greek city-states. They used bronze armor and helmets. They used spears, and they would have a round shield. They fought in a formation called the phalanx. And the word phalanx actually means roller. So they would come at you with their shields locked together. And as you can see, your shield protects part of you, but also part of the buddy next to you. Okay, they would use the shield in their left hand, and they would have a spear in their right hand. And what they would do is they would lock up, kind of like watching football on TV. You see the offensive line and defensive line lock up against each other and try to push each other around. That's how it worked when the Greeks fought other Greeks. Okay, and you would eventually tire out your enemy, and as they got tired of being pushed around, they would break their ranks and run, and that's when you would be able to attack them. So the phalanx was made up of rows of men. Now this is a Macedonian phalanx, which would come later on. The original Greek phalanxes were only 3 to 5 rows deep, with men being in much longer lines, and their spears were a little bit shorter than what we see here. Okay, so the goal was to steamroll their opponents. Spartan girls did receive military training. They also were required to run, wrestle, and play sports. They wanted healthy and strong women, so that these women could have healthy and strong babies who would grow up to become great soldiers. It all comes back to being the best soldier you can be. Unlike in Athens, Spartan women had a lot of freedom. They would run the estate. They could inherit property from their dead husbands. And they needed to be able to run the estate because their husbands were living at the barracks or out in the field with the army. So they needed to be able to control the lands that their family lived on. And military came first even for these women. They were known for telling their husbands, when their husband went off to war, come back with your shield or come back on it. Meaning, come back with your shield because you won, or come back on your shield, come back dead. But don't come back without your shield. If you came back without your shield, it means you threw your shield down and you ran away from the battle. And they did not want to deal with cowardly husbands. So you come back with your shield in victory, or you come back dead, but don't come back any other way. In Spartan culture, all forms of individual expression were discouraged. You were just a cog in the military machine. They did not value art, literature, or any other artistic or intellectual pursuits. They distrusted traders. Okay, they thought traders were outsiders who were trying to undermine their culture. They valued duty, strength, and discipline above all else. You had no freedom, individuality. They weren't concerned with beauty or learning. Just be the best soldier. They had some artwork, but their artwork was not very polished compared to Athenian artwork, as we see here. And the only way you could trade in Sparta were using these iron bars. That was their form of currency. Nobody wanted to carry them around, so Spartans really didn't trade much. But if they did, they used these iron bars that were unwieldy. So that's going to be it for Athens and Sparta. Next class, we're going to look at how they had to work together to defeat a big-time adversary in the Persians.